generations theory is what we're going to be discussing, and this is almost going to be a two-parter. So we're also going to discuss World War III, which generations theory suggests is going to be coming in the next, I think in the next 10 years, as it suggests. No, it was early 2020s. So we're going to discuss how and why people think that generations theory may be able to make that kind of prediction. And we're going to discuss what generations theory is. Generations theory is actually it comes from two people, I guess, William Strauss and Neil Howe, who published a book called Generations, The History of America's Future. And they are the ones who actually also dubbed generation, I think they started with, what was the first, they coined the term millennial, and they predicted sort of many characteristics of millennials before that generation. Oh, and okay, I hear him trying to connect one more time with it. We will have him back to discuss World War III. Now, I've spent a little time discussing World War III actually with him. The general consensus tends to be that World War III will come probably from China, if and when it comes. I know, obviously, the hope for everybody is that we are going to avoid it, but China has been increasing its military offensive capability. China has a unique issue, which is if they want to attack anyone, they have to have a navy capable of deploying the military elsewhere. So they have to be able to move their tanks. They have to be able to move mass amounts of military, and they have been changing their. They have been sort of re-gearing their navy for a much more offensive navy, and that's obviously been very concerning. The general consensus has been that China may start acting aggressively. However, China also has a great deal of our debt, so it's not necessarily in their economic interest to do so. Now, according to our guest, John Shook, we shouldn't be looking to China for World War III, but actually Russia. And he says generations theory explains this. Generations theory, now people use the term, sort of a generation or generations very loosely. Generations theory is a very specific theory based on this book that these two men have posited. And it discusses how generations change from one generation to another, how the previous generation sort of affects the next one and the next one and the next one. It says that it actually goes by very specific patterns that are predictable and that can be understood and predicted well in advance. This theory, actually, one of the things I noticed was it predicts the loss of Joe Biden. So we're going to discuss that. And all right, so what I have managed to do is sort of very poorly, I think, explain the fact that there is something called generations theory. It comes from a book published by William Strauss and Neil Howe called Generations, The History of America's Future. And that they are the ones who basically coined the term millennials, and that they have successfully predicted what millennials would probably be like. So that's all I've said. So do you think you might be able to tell us a little bit more about what generations theory is and how and what it's used for? Now, we do have, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually move us over to this here so that we can all see your slides, which are now up on the screen and available. So I can move with that at will. So why don't you tell us a little bit about generations theory?
Sure. Generations theory begins with history and patterns that you can find in history. If you're showing the audience the slides, you can move to the second slide, which has its header, William Strauss and Neil Howe. They deserve the credit, so we ought to put their books up for display.
All right. So let's, yeah, we are there.
So William Strauss died a few years ago. Neil Howe is still, as far as I know, alive and well, living in the DC area. And they produced 4 books together about generations theory. The big one is there on the left, Generations Predicting America's Future, all the way out to 2069. And the pattern repeats, so you could keep going beyond that. Then they came out with a book called 13 Gen in the mid 90s, and then two more books finishing up in the early 2000s. And these books are easily available at your favorite bookseller, all in paperback, easy to get. Now, I'm only going to talk today about the first book, Generations, which has got all the theory. The later books are refinements and confirmations and further details, but the basic theory is unchanged from their work in the 1980s, culminating in the book in 1991. So their theory really has three parts. You can move on to the next slide about American wars, because this catches the eye the fastest. As historians, they're interested in events, but they're also interested in patterns of events. And Strauss and Howe weren't the first historians to notice very interesting regular patterns to national history and international history. Arthur Schlesinger, for example, famous American historian, he found the same overall pattern. And the easiest way to see the pattern is to start with American wars. Not just minor wars, not just overseas conflicts, but major wars that potentially or actually involve the homeland. Territory integrity was extremely costly, both in terms of government expenditures on the military and in lives lost. So if we're looking at the same chart, you see there are American wars ranked by deaths per million, because you got to adjust for per capita, the overall population. Yeah. And of course, the Civil War always comes out on top. Historians easily focused on the Civil War. The deaths per million was over 23,000 deaths per million. That's adding up both combat and civilian losses, as you have to do with these sorts of things. Number two is the Revolutionary War. That makes sense. Number three is a forgotten war. It's a colonial war, King William's War, and it lasted for almost a decade. And even though total combat and civilian deaths, as far as historians could tell, and of course incomplete records are a major problem going back to the 17th century, the per capita, per population size was almost as devastating as the Revolutionary War. There just weren't that many people living in the northern colonies. So the deaths per million was almost 8,000. King William's War almost extinguished about 10% of the colonial settlements north of New York City, and some of the conflict was in the South. It was connected to King William, of course, not a king here. We were a British colony. And so, like the Revolutionary War, King William's War was deeply connected to political upheavals on both sides of the Atlantic. Of course, we were British subjects at the start of both of those conflicts. Number three, King William's War. Don't forget about that. Number four, of course, World War II, about 3,000 deaths per million. And those are your top four. The War of 1812, World War I, Mexican War, Vietnam War, much less significant. So we're looking at major wars involving existential risk to life, liberty, property. Mm-hmm. If we're looking at the next slide, you put those major wars into chronological order, as historians will do. So about 86 years passed between King William's War and the American Revolution, if we're looking at that slide. I apologize to my audience. I'm flying blind here. I can't.
I'm impressed.
Yeah. Back to the show.
So we've got, King William's, 86 years after was, so 86 years between. So the King William's, the American Revolution, and then another 86 to the Civil, 80 to World War II, 80 presumably to the 2020s war.
Right, exactly. And in later work, Howe and Strauss said this can't be a coincidence. As historians, they easily look back into English history. And as an exercise for the readers, they can do this for themselves. The 85 to 90 year pattern, somewhere in there, sometimes it's a little shorter, as short as 80 years, keeps going back into British history. The War of the Roses would be an example. So why is there an Anglo-American pattern to major wars every roughly 80 to 90 years? Then they looked at intervening events. In America, you can find a pattern, again, roughly separated by around 85 years, plus or minus 5 years, of what are called by religious historians spiritual awakenings. And we remember the first Great Awakening, perhaps. This is Jonathan Edwards and his generation, the first Great Awakening. But again, historians of England can track that back to various Puritan revolutions and other sorts of religious revivals and rebellions against orthodoxy, again going back another 400 years into British history. So these patterns are real. They're objectively there. They're not created by the historians. Any historian can look at the same data and say, yeah, this is exactly what is going on. So this is the empirical component to the theory, and you can't argue with it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not arguable. Mm-hmm. In other words, this is the empirical side of anything scientific. So the second component that you need for an objective scientific theory is sort of a mechanism. In other words, what are the causal forces behind these patterns? And that's where generational theory comes in. Mm-hmm. Generational theory is inspired by the empirical historical patterns, and generational theory is then the second stage, the causal mechanism. What is responsible for these regular events? So as historians, they were able to go back and look at the individuals participating in these major events. And they found two additional patterns having to do with causes. What is responsible for the overarching first pattern empirically that I talked about? And what they found is if you look at the generations participating in each of the wars, and then you look at the generations participating in each of the awakenings, you find another set of patterns. During the wars, you always find the same generational lineup. You find in elder leadership position an idealistic generation, roughly aged 55 to 75, and they are known as a generation for being very principled. Everything they see is in black or white. They're veterans of culture wars that have taken place when they were younger in age. They all came of age during an awakening in their teens and 20s. Now in their 60s and 70s, they are the top leadership. They occupy colonial governors, or they are state governors, presidents, leading members of Congress, and that sort of thing. In other words, people in a position to decide whether to go to war or not, and how the war will be prosecuted. The lineup that's familiar to us is, of course, World War II. We can use that as an example. And the generation that was in America's leadership during the 1930s and 1940s was a generation called the missionary generation, and they came of age during the Third Great Awakening. It was a vast revival, churches refilled during the 1880s, 1890s, and they went overseas in vast numbers. That's how they sort of got their name, missionary generation. This is Roosevelt's generation.
Okay.
And Roosevelt was surrounded similarly by gray old men. The Roosevelt cabinet, the Roosevelt war secretaries, They were all similarly in their late 60s and 70s, as was Roosevelt during this time. And they were known for hard and fast principled leadership. It was a moralistic crusade like they knew 40 years earlier when they were younger. The generals that they had, Eisenhower, Patton, very different generation, and everybody knew. Roosevelt relied on a series of Army and naval commanders who were known not for their moralistic principle or their good behavior, but rather for a get it done, pragmatic at all costs attitude.
Now,
And they had proven this sort of pragmatism back during World War I. We know them now as the lost generation, literary figures like Hemingway and so forth. George
let me ask
Patton
one
was a
question though,
classic
because
example.
you say
Sure.
morality. How are you defining morality in this case? Because morality is something that changes over time, and it changes a great deal. So when you say moral, do you mean
No, we should
moral?
have a whole show on that. It doesn't really,
Oh,
because
okay.
I'm not talking about morality. I'm talking about ethics.
Okay.
Ethics is what are you willing to do for your morality? I'm talking about idealistic generations at political leadership during these great secular crises that are known for hard and fast principled ethics. That is to say, they put their moral judgments ahead of all else economic, safety, security. They are willing to take a stand on principle and damn the consequences. It is usually some combination of religious, spiritual principles. They believe that they're doing the work of God, or at the very least, they feel like their generation, in the words of Roosevelt, has a rendezvous with destiny. Roosevelt's seniors understood what Roosevelt was saying about a rendezvous with destiny. He was hearkening back to the moralistic principles that they were attached to in their teens and 20s. So I'm talking about ethics. Now,
Hmm.
morality, in fact, doesn't change. That's a show for another time. I think you're confusing cultural traditions and customs with morality. But I'm talking about a third thing altogether. That's
All right.
ethics. And we're looking at a generation of baby boomers. Well, they're not babies anymore, they're just boomers. Similarly, they're known for standing on principle. Name the generation during the 20th century that, on purely moralistic principle, frequently doomed the federal budget to collision and catastrophe. Oh, right. It's the boomer generation. This is the kind of moralistic idealism that I'm talking about here.
Okay.
Let me finish out the generational lineup. We recall great generals and naval commanders for a get it done attitude, and they were revered by the third generation that is always on the scene, rising adults. In wartime, of course, there are uniformed servicemen, and we call them today the greatest generation, but at the time they were ranged 16 to 30. This GI generation born during the 20th century, and this is very important. They knew who they were. They were born after 1900, and in retrospect, in the words of John F. Kennedy, that generation born in this century, it's in one of his famous speeches, again echoing Roosevelt's rendezvous with destiny, that GI generation president, John F. Kennedy, then was willing to launch his generation into new secular battlefronts. One of them turned out to be the Vietnam War, but other ones turned out to be, for example, the war on poverty, the moon race, and these sorts of things. So these generations have a sense of who they are, and they have a sense of destiny, and they're not wrong about that. So you always find that same threefold generational lineup: elder idealists going into war on staunch moral principles, damn the consequences.
Hmm.
A second generation of 40 to 60-year-olds, roughly, known for sort of a pragmatic, keep your head down, get it done at all costs, Don't ask how we did it. This is not a generation known for known for moral principle. Today's generation, of course, is the Xers, and then a rising generation that is already appreciated for its willingness to sacrifice, for its respect for authority, for its expectation to be put in uniform at every year of their lives. Back then it was the GI generation. Now it's the millennial generation, which has marched in line and worn school uniforms ever since they hit kindergartens back in the 1980s. So these are the generational lineup, and that's the causal mechanism of why we keep going into these regular secular crises every 80, 85, 90 years, and interspersed by the religious awakenings.
All right, so so the slide that we're on now is turnings from 1517 to 2029, and so is it a rebound effect or a backlash against the generation beforehand, and that's sort of causing a pendulum?
No, that's not generation theory. So you have
All
to
right.
understand each generation as a product of the times that it went through, and each generation is trying to overcome what it viewed as the biggest problems. But each generation, and there's a fourth one we haven't brought in yet, but I'm going to, each generation is, of course, trying to oversteer and overcorrect for what it viewed as America's biggest problems when it was young.
Mm.
So, for example, the boomers in elderhood, now that they have the reins of power, are going to try to steer America back to adherence to pure ethical principle and righteous duty that they believed was missing in America when they were growing up during the 60s and 70s. In the 60s and 70s, we remember hippies and troubadours, of course, singing about love and peace and these sorts of things. They were, of course, complaining against the GI generation that they viewed as too materialistic. But so they're sort of creating their own storm system. Each generation, once it acquires leadership power, is looking at a world through its own lens. Take, for example, the next generation, my generation, Xers. If you're 40s, 50s, you're an Xer, born in the 60s or in the 70s, and you're trying to overcorrect for what you viewed as chaos, anarchy, lack of
Mm.
parental supervision. The 60s and 70s was not a warm, friendly place for children at all. Uh, Violence against children was far higher during the 60s and 70s than it ever was in the 90s or 2Ks, forgotten. So the Xer generation became the over mothering, the over parenting, the helicopter generation, trying to overprotect the millennials and the younger generation behind the millennials called the homelanders by Howe and Strauss. So each generation is trying to steer America back into what it has neglected, what it has lost. And that's why the boomers in elderhood will always steer into the most principled conflicts and heedless of the cost. At any materialistic price, they will achieve their idealistic objectives over and over and over again every 80, 85, 90 years.
All right. So as what you had said earlier, I believe like an overcorrection for the what was absent in their childhood.
Sure.
All right. So okay. So was there now? We missed one generation you wanted to cover, or
Right. So their theory is that it's a four-stroke cycle. It just keeps repeating, and the order is in a later slide, but I've sort of kind of outlined, right? At the time of a secular crisis, as we are in now, exactly as predicted 30 years ago, we're sailing into some combination of civil war or possibly World War III or both at the same time. That's also entirely possible according to this theory. You're looking at elders, known for their idealistic, principled, uncompromising stance. The middle-aged, sort of a little bit more anarchical, certainly go it alone. They're capable of being nomads. They're capable of taking enormous risk. That's kind of what we've always been known for since the 80s, when the boomers looked pitifully down upon us as teenagers, as in The Breakfast Club and other movies, The Brat Pack, and so on. The generation after that, of course, is the millennials, the rising young adults who are, deserving their reputation for being more clean cut, more civic oriented. The millennials have served more time in public service and community service practically since the cradle than any generation in American history. And following them, there is a generation that is young during a secular conflict. They're in elementary schools now, but they're going to watch from the sidelines. They're going to be the most overprotected generation. What are they going to turn out to be like? Well, we can turn back the clock to see exactly what they're going to be like. Look at the generational lineup during World War II. You had Roosevelt's generation of elder missionary types, the next generation, the lost generation that supplied the top brass military leadership, then the GI generation in uniform, and then the fourth generation, which again tends to get overlooked, the generation, my father's generation, what the Howard Strauss coined as the silent generation. But they weren't silent. They were very outspoken and lent America much of its cultural flavor during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. This is Joe Biden's generation. He's the very last representative in American politics, born in 42, the same year as my mother. The very last generation of this silent generation. They're fading from political power, just as Howard Strauss predicted, but they exerted the greatest influence on American culture, trying to overcompensate for what they viewed as excessive conformity during the 40s, 50s, and 60s. This silent generation brought to America civil rights. Martin Luther King Jr. was of this silent generation. Not so silent. What they spent their voice on was cultural expression, artistic achievement, civil rights movements, sort of trying to loosen up America. So that's your four-stroke cycle. And in their book, right, Generations, they go all the way back to the Puritan age, and they find similarly that four-generational lineup, and they always happen in the same order. Your idealists, what they call the reactives or the nomads, the sort of lost generation caught in between, followed by a very civic-minded, highly educated generation, followed by a sort of keep your head down conformist generation that is known for more about artistic and cultural expression. So what explains that? Now we're really getting into the details.
I do want to make a quick. So you wrote a paper predicting presidents and wars. The greatest tests for generation theories have arrived, and in it you said, and I took note of this. According to Generations, the presidency will never be held by someone among the silent generation, and you pointed out that Biden is in that silent generation. So certainly,
no, they didn't. I said never. They said the weakest. So they didn't rule it out.
Oh, okay.
So in 1990, their words were, the silent, to everybody's surprise, will be fated to have the weakest grip on the highest levels of political leadership in this country. Most generations, because they last 20 to 25 years, will have sort of in elderhood that sort of span of opportunity to be president, vice president, chief justice of the Supreme Court, speaker of the House, majority leader of the Senate, right? Sort of the top leadership. If no silent ever attained the presidency or Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, that would be a confirmation of the theory, because the theory says the weakest. And it's very difficult to find another generation that has only had one president. Even if Biden gets elected, generation theory is still confirmed, because it is extraordinarily weak to only get one member of your generation into either the presidency or Chief Justice. That would still be the weakest of any generation going back 15 generations. So Biden, win or lose, is still a confirmation of the theory, because back in 1990, you would have assumed that the silent generation had an equal shot, getting at least 3 or 4 presidencies, right?
Yep.
They're barely going to get one if Biden wins. If Biden loses, they're going to get 0. So that's why I say either way, generation theory is going to be confirmed. There's another way in this. Biden is barely a silent. He was born in the very last 6 months of the last year of the last cohort of the silent generation. He comes across very much as still a member of the silent generation, no more for compromise committee work than sort of going it alone. So that's why I say Biden, win or lose, generation theory is not disconfirmed. It's highly confirmed. There just hasn't been another American generation with such a weak grip on power. You'd have to go back 100, 150 years. Similarly, the GI generation, a generation that was in uniform and in the front lines during one of these secular crises, they tend in elderhood to have more than average grip on the presidency. Think, for example, the Greatest Generation. The first member of the Greatest Generation to be president was, of course, JFK. And then you had a series. The lost were locked out. The last lost were Truman and Eisenhower, and the lost never got it back. So if you go from Kennedy in 1960 all the way to the last GI president, which was, of course, the first Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, who left office in 92. That's an extraordinary span, right? That's 32 years of but that also confirms the pattern. The GI generation types tend to have more than average. The silent types have to have less than average.
All right, so I asked that one in particular because, of course, we are also a news program and we've been following the election. We also are somewhat left-leaning, so where if this theory suggests that Biden is unlikely to win, not necessarily prohibitive, but just sort of unlikely, that's of interest.
My recommendation, if anybody had asked me, and nobody asked me a year or so more ago, I would have said, look, in order, if you want the highest guarantee of a Democratic win in 2020, don't put up a member of the silent generation. Do we have a slide of the silent? Is that slide number 9? You could jump ahead.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, so let's I can.
Slide 9.
I can go to 9, no problem. So there's 8. Here's 9. Starts 1991. The silent. Is this correct?
Yeah. That's the quote. It doesn't say there won't be any silent. It says it'll be the shortest and weakest tenure in Leitner days. That's going back 200 years. That's where I say the theory has now been confirmed, whether or not Biden wins or loses, because to have only one, and they've been shut out of the Supreme Court, and there were only 2 members of the silent generation that ever managed to attain Speaker of the House, which is pretty weak indeed. But look at the lineup of silent. Edward Kennedy, remember him? Walter Mondale, Michael Dukakis, Gary Hart, Jesse Jackson, Paul Simon, H. Ross Perot, Ralph Nader, Ron Paul, Buchanan, McCain, Sanders. Now we have Biden. We'll have to wait on Biden. But what all those names have in common is, of course, Americans, if they were look at that name, they're all losers. They're all losers.
Well,
and the reason why they lost is because they came across as too conformist, to keep your head down. They had no impressive go it alone political victories before in their career. None of them are
Yep.
known for any major big decisions that you could point to and say, I went it alone. This is a generation that doesn't do anything by themselves. They're
Well, and he does.
compromising. They do
Biden.
their best work in committees, all of them. And America took a look at them and said, this is not executive material. Biden, this country is taking a look, but I think that if it weren't for COVID, surprisingly coming along in 2020, Trump would have been easily reelected. So
Which does actually
Biden
beg
needed
a.
COVID.
Uh,
And a year ago, without knowing that COVID would arrive, my political recommendation would be stay away from the silent. They could go completely, 0 for 18, trying to attain the highest office of the land. If you want to beat Trump, you're going to have to either have a similarly loud, brash, and principled baby boomer that can go toe to toe with Trump. You might have wanted to go with, somebody like uh, you know, possibly. Well, anyway, it's too late to. But put up a baby boomer or at least a very brash Xer. Now, Biden, I think, was smart in picking Kamala Harris. She really appeals to her own generation, the Xers. We can kind of see her in us and vice versa. So that was probably a smart move. But I think without COVID, Biden would have lost, and generation theory would have been amply confirmed.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I will say also that I do think Biden is often seen as Obama light, and I think Obama was already kind of much more centrist. He wasn't quite as liberal, I think, as he got.
Well,
So
sure, he was an Xer. He was a
yeah.
pragmatist. Everybody knew it. Nobody confused Obama with a baby boomer. Obama was
So
born in 1961, the first cohort year of the Xers.
well, and there are a lot of people who think that actually, sorry, not McCain. Wow, Biden wouldn't actually successfully complete his first term. I mean, that's people are already saying that, and so I think that he does seem and feel like a weak candidate going in, and the assumption is that he's not even going to really be able to hold it. It's going to be his VP for either health reasons or just yeah. So
Well, thanks to medicine, we're in a new era. I know plenty of 80-year-olds that could run circles around me, unfortunately, because I don't run. So we'll have to see. But yeah, it could be that if Biden only serves one term, or he is forced to leave office, or the worst occurs. But interestingly enough, I think Kamala Harris would make an excellent president. I think the country is going to be ready for Xer leadership in the middle of either a civil war or World War III, which, by the way, has already started. So the other major wild-eyed prediction made 30 years ago that during the early 2020s, we'd be sailing into a major civic conflict on the homeland, that has already been confirmed. It's not a matter of speculation.
well, and I've heard it said too that so I want to dig into a couple of things here. So I've heard it said that actually a second civil war has already started. So
That's what I'm saying.
oh,
That's what I'm
okay.
saying.
So I'd like to
In
I'd
other
like to
words,
discuss that, and then
generations
yeah.
theory, just looking at the empirical pattern, will predict a major secular as opposed to a religious crisis. That's the awakenings. We're not talking about that now. Secular civic crisis. But whether it's a civil war, an external war, or some combination, that's how you can't really predict that 30 years out. You kind of get on top of it. But think about the previous four major civic crises on American soil. The King William's War, that was fomented by external problems, both French and Indian, plus English political chaos. So that was more like a external war, a traditional colonial war. The Revolution, the American Revolution, was of course a civil war. I mean, the correct classification of the
That's a good
American
point.
Revolution was
Yeah.
British subject versus British subjects who didn't want to be British subjects. That's called a
And we
civil
just
war.
won. I mean,
The
we
fact that we had to deal with troops coming across the Atlantic just made it obvious. The Civil War, of course, Civil War. And during the 1930s, we could have easily gone into a civil war over various kinds of economic and social crises. But as we know, and thanks to the leadership of Roosevelt, World War II was already going to hit us. So World War II saved this country from going into a civil war.
Well, so
A similar thing may happen in the 2020s. In other words, we may be well into a civil war here, but external conditions, partially of our own making. America is a big superpower. Again, we kind of make our own global weather. In another couple of years, we could be looking at the entry into World War III, but that might be a show for another show.
Oh, well, we've got you booked for another show, I think exclusively on that, because I think this is we're going to use as kind of a primer to that one. But I did want to ask, so now we've been talking about, now you did say that these wars, we continued them back through England from before the founding of the United States. So would we see these generations lining up across other countries that are, do they, so my first question is, do other countries have these four generational cycles, and if so, are they in line with ours?
They haven't been, but they will be. So the answer is yes, yes, and watch out. So let's go back to the first part of your question. What you need is, of course, some sort of large nation that's pretty much in control of its own civic, secular, and military affairs. That rules out a lot of little countries. You're not going to see this pattern in like Zaire or Ecuador. They're just not in enough. Their own generations don't have enough control. External factors, regional things tend to swamp them. So you'd have to look at major civilizations, major nations that would come easily to mind, even with a high schooler. The book, The Fourth Turning, is the book to read if you're interested, because there Howe and Strauss cover a large number of historical nations, empires, and civilizations, and they see the same pattern with the help of other historians. So they go, for example, back to ancient Greece, they go back to ancient Rome, ancient China, and then coming forward, of course, the example that they use, because it's connected to our own fate, is Britain. And this pattern goes back. In fact, if maybe you go back to the slide number 5, the turnings from 1517 back, slide 5, you
Yep,
can
we're there.
see how going back into the Anglo side of the history, this goes back to the Protestant Reformation and all the way back to the Armada crisis. Of course, the Protestant Reformation, their Great Awakening back in the early 16th century. And in fact, there's evidence you can even go back beyond that. So you can look at the book, The Fourth Turning, and that's where they cover a similar pattern. Again, it's not going to be every nation. It's going to have to be a major nation in control of both internal civic affairs and be able to hold its own with external wars for a long enough period of time. Say you've at least got to go through the 4-stroke cycle. But once you go through a complete 4-stroke cycle lasting somewhere 90, 110 years, then it will, all other things being equal, tend to repeat itself. So you can go through French history, for example, and see a similar pattern, because France has been big enough and in charge of its own internal and external affairs for as long as England.
All right. So is now you had mentioned, so COVID is a very big thing. Obviously, it is a
Yes.
global health crisis, and nonetheless appears to, if it's had an impact on this, still be a minor impact. If Biden gets in, I think you're right. If Biden gets in, the one of the biggies will be him being able to demonstrate Trump's utter failure at dealing with COVID, and people buying that narrative. So and even then, that doesn't, again, as you pointed out, contradict the theory, because they never said it wouldn't happen. They just said it would have the weakest. So I mean, it's like,
Well, in
if
fact, this book predicts a pandemic during America's fourth turning
well,
as one of the possible scenarios that tips America into a clear civic crisis.
Well,
They mention other possibilities, terrorist attack. Oh, wait, that also happened in the late stages of the cycle. So, they couldn't in 1991 tell you exactly which one, but they did give you a recipe, some combination of which was fated to happen around 2020.
so given that COVID at least would nudge this at least in one direction or another, do you think it's sufficient to well, I shouldn't say sufficient to preempt something like this happening, because it actually, as you had sort of suggested, it seems like it's almost part of the cause of this happening, which makes it kind of a little
Well,
spooky.
let me clarify so that people understand generations theory.
Yes.
Only epidemiologists can sort of predict pandemics, and even then, it's not any more accurate than predicting earthquakes. It's more of an art than a science. Generations is not about predicting black swan events. What generations theory is about is predicting generational responses to black swan
Ah,
unusual events. That can be predicted. So, for example, they point out that if a major crisis like a terrorist attack or a pandemic were to hit America, America's response will be largely dictated by the generation that happens to be in elder leadership at the time, even down to the individual. For example, the book points out you take something like a pandemic. When a pandemic hits earlier in the phase, let's say right after victory in a major secular crisis, the last time we would have had that would have been like the 1950s, 1960s, the feel good era of Eisenhower, great material prosperity, everything going well. A pandemic comes along, and that generation is going to deal with it brutally, swiftly, like it's another military attack on the United States. It's going to be about pragmatism, not principle, and no material resources will be spared, including huge deficits. If a pandemic were to hit in a second turning, that is to say, around 40 years after the last secular crisis, we know it as the 60s and 70s, there will be a sort of swift response, but it may look for an external cause. This is a time when the GI-like generation is going to look beyond its borders and find fault with other countries. That might have been. Similarly, pandemic that hits in the 80s or 90s, like AIDS, it's suddenly going to have a moralistic tinge. In other words, and this happens to the AIDS crisis, it's not about the disease, it's about who gets the disease. Why was that happening? Well, because you had a rising generation of baby boomers that it was mostly afflicting, and it all of a sudden became about harsh moral judgment on a subgroup of Americans. Now, at the start of a fourth turning, our authors say that by that time, with the baby boomers in elderhood, a response to something like a pandemic is going to be extraordinarily principled, but it matters whose principles. It turns out
mm,
we're fated to have Trump from the baby boomers, and his principles that he took a stand on were purely partisan principles, more like a Newt Gingrich approach, which the book also predicts. Um, the generational response can be largely predictable. Right now, because of baby boomer leadership, everybody is looking at America and seeing America broken. This was inconceivable during the 90s, impossible to conceive of during the 70s. But we're now in a situation where America really does feel completely broken. And this generation was fated to start off on the wrong foot by making a completely broken and chaotic response.
let me ask, just because we've touched on it, and then I think we'll start to maybe put a pin on this, because we are going to have you back. We've actually got you scheduled for Tuesday, October 13th at 2, and we'll make sure that the connection's a little bit better for that. But I did want to ask you, because you the way you seem to be speaking, it almost sounds like is there any mapping of sort of general normative ethical theories such as deontology, virtue ethics, um, onto these generations, or are those just completely, we're talking incommensurate? You can't, because it does sound like it, it it does sound, and it's been a while since I've gotten into these theories, but it sounds like Trump is almost sort of a virtue ethicist. He's sitting there, there are very specific virtues that at least he claims to hold and to go by, and damn the consequences. Is that am I just way out on left field there, or does that
Yeah,
sound
it doesn't map like that.
okay? All right.
None of the ethical theories are capable of covering everything that we call ethics. They're all just prisms. Instead, what is happening is not so much which principles, but how principled are you willing to get? In other words, it's not ethics, it's how much ethics and what kind. So, for example, let's take our idealist generations. We have one now in our hands in elderhood, the baby boomers. Their approach to ethics is very moralistic, puritanical, practically. Think about television advertising to baby boomers, to baby boomers. Uh, Advertising to baby boomers during the 80s and 90s suddenly became about principle. Who are you really? Are you aligned with who you ought to be? It's a very inner focused generation, to the
Mhm.
practical point of narcissism that baby boomers get that accusation, and not without reason. Now in elderhood, if you need to sell a Cadillac to a baby boomer, have you noticed the ads are in black and white?
Right, I
Have you
hadn't.
noticed that the
No,
ads are black and white? It's very
no.
principled, and you have a baby boomer actor talking almost in Zen like fashion about their Cadillac Escalade, right? So, but this makes sense to the boomer sensibility. Who are
Mm,
you, and are you aligned with transcendental principles, right? Is your soul in order? And if not, you're a problem, and we're going to route around you. This is the baby boomer approach. Very, very different for Xers. We grew up in moralistic chaos and neglect. This was a time when the silent generation was all busy divorcing each other. So we're the children of the greatest divorce surge in American history. And we grew up at a time when children were not welcome in restaurants and seatbelts weren't in cars. We noticed. We got the message. We were the latchkey kids. The parents weren't around. Well, we entertained ourselves and got into a fair bit of trouble for it. We're the generation known rightly for getting into the most drug use trouble, the greatest crime waves. This,
mm,
this is our generation.
yeah.
Um, and now in sort of middle age, we're looking around and we don't trust moralistic principles. We don't trust the righteous words coming out of our elders' mouths because we've never been able to trust them. They weren't there for us. We just
Mm,
don't trust politicians at all. And you can see it on our voting patterns. We're a very cynical generation when it comes to higher ethical principle. If you want to reach Xers, you've got to show us. Show us. Because what you do tells us about what you think and believe. We're a very pragmatist generation. For the millennials, their approach to ethics is again, turn it 90 degrees, very different. Their approach to ethics is it good for the group? Because if it isn't good for the group, it just isn't ethical. Show us large numbers of people all doing the same thing, going in the same direction. That's where their antenna radar go. That's what they use social media for. The best decision is the one that is approved of by the most peers. That's how they do ethics. And that's how they're going to do ethics for the rest of their lives. It's how they're going to be voting. They put trust in authority. They put trust in bigness in every form. They're the most pro-government generation since the GI generation that came of age during Roosevelt's work projects designed for them. They trust big government. They like big government. They don't particularly care if it's principled or not. If it's for the good of everybody, they'll put their trust in it. And so it goes.
All right, so you've covered boomers, Xers, and millennials. Did you now is this
Yeah,
silent
so
or
the silent generation is going to put its trust in things like individual rights and diversity, pluralism, consensus. These are the watchwords for a silent type generation. Going back before the Civil War, you remember Henry Clay? You remember the compromises of 1820, the compromises of 1850, trying to hold this country together despite slavery and the South. Clay, Calhoun, these types, they were a similar Xer type generation, except they came of age in the aftermath of the Revolutionary War, not World War II. But similarly, at all costs, they made every compromise possible. They didn't take a stand on moralistic principle. Unity, despite plurality,
mm,
was their watchword. The reason why the Civil War happened when it did in 1860 is precisely because that silent-like generation just got too old, passed from political power, and the rising next generation, you know them as the transcendental generation of the Second American Awakening during the 1820s and 1830s. They now held a plurality of power in Congress. They grabbed the presidency with Abraham Lincoln, and the Civil War was on because the South had a similarly rising transcendental generation of Davis and Lee, and compromise became impossible and not what God wanted. So it was going to be a war for righteousness.
wow. Well, this is I think this is fascinating stuff. One of the things we're going to do is we're going to put links to every book that you've mentioned, and they're in the slides that we put up. We're going to put those links in the description, so anybody who wants to access them, they're going to be right in the description there. You can go find those books if you want to learn more. We're also going to be bringing you back, as I said, on the 13th, Tuesday the 13th at 2 p.m. to discuss World War III, which Generations Theory says is basically right around the corner, and or at least an American
Yeah,
Civil War is starting. If yes,
because of various factors that we'll be talking about. Although it would have at least been a civil war, and we're kind of already seeing that on the streets of America, fomented by American boomer leadership. Uh, I think now we can say it's just as equally likely that we're also going to have World War III, and I'm going to explain why in the next show.
and it was I think the way they said it was like how did they describe the event, like a major disturbing event, or so whether it would be World War III or a
Well, yeah,
civil.
that's slide 6, and if you want to leave it
Right.
there, that's a frightening slide to read. A great
All right.
segue to the next one if you pull it out. Howard and Strauss in 1991, inconceivable. But this is why generations theory is becoming scientific. You can have a pattern going in the past. You can figure out some causes dealing with the future. But if you want a scientific theory, you've got to make interesting, specific, risky predictions that nobody else is willing to make. They made them 30 years ago, and the very last biggest ones are now all coming true. So we're dealing now with a scientific theory. People can read slide 6. Are they looking at it?
It's up there right now. Howe
Anybody
and
who
Strauss
claims to
19.
possess a
Yeah,
vision of the future, right? Um, but they say we're not going to be able to tell you exactly how things are going to work out in 30 years. But what they call the crisis of 2020. What we do claim is that during the late 2010s and early 2020s, American generations will pass into a crisis era constellation and mood. That has happened. Everybody sees the fracturing and chaos of American civic life. And as a consequence, the nation's public life will undergo a swift and possibly revolutionary transformation. For the first time in 80 to 85 years, it is all on the table. Everything that you take for granted about American civic and social institutions, forget your assumptions. The chessboard is not just being rearranged. The chessboard is being overturned. Overturned. Yeah.
it does seem like an apropos description. Yeah. I think I hesitate. The only reason I hesitate is because I think most generations do feel that way at some point or another when they come across the how their ideals meet with the reality, especially as they sort of assume the mantle of control. But this does feel different. I mean, it's especially what's happening
This
in our
lineup
government.
has not happened. America does not feel this way. Lack of confidence and cynicism in all things big, no respect between generations, suspicion and righteous principle dominating. America has not had this feeling, this atmosphere since the late 1930s. Historians can confirm it. So that the skies are darkening for a reason.
All right. Well, uh, John, Dr. Shook, thank you
Oh,
so
John
much
is fine.
for coming. Um, we really appreciate having you on. Thank you very much for explaining this to us. I do look forward to our follow-up on the 13th. I think this has been very interesting, and I hope all of you who are watching will come by and ask questions, and we'll try to have a bit more back and forth on that Tuesday and have that discussion. But until then, thank you very much for joining us. We'll be doing our patron hangout. Let's see, that is the first Monday, so that's going to be coming up. Actually, that's before then. Our patron hangout is Monday, October 5th at 2 p.m. So if you're not a patron and want to become a patron, please do join us for that. It's you can even sign up on the day of, and we look forward to seeing you then. Until then, my name is Nick, and thank you all for joining us. And thank you again, John.
Thanks.